following is a work of fiction and should not be taken as actual history.
Meet Professor Roger Hill, historian, adventurer, and raconteur extraordinaire. He travels to parallel worlds where history went differently and brings back lectures on his findings. So grab a prime seat, pay attention, and take good notes. This is Alternate History 100. Welcome to the class.
Good morning. I took a psych course back in college, and one of the things I remember from it is the halo horns effect. In a nutshell, this describes the phenomenon where a single perception of someone, good or bad, will color everything else they do in the mind of the observer. For example, if you have a positive perception of someone, you may see their bold actions as a sign of confidence. If you have a negative perception, you may see those same actions as a sign of arrogance. Same observation, different interpretation. And isn't history all about how we interpret the actions of those who went before us? And doesn't that interpretation define their legacy? The point of divergence for today's alternate history occurred on September 14th, 1955. You'll never get this one.
The death of James Dean?
No, it was not the death of James Dean. That was September 30th. Good guess, though, and maybe one for me to investigate. You won't get it, so I'll just dive right in. On that date in our world, President Eisenhower suffered a heart attack. We almost lost him. And in that world, they did lose him. It was the first death of a sitting president since...
Franklin D. Roosevelt.
You got it, Franklin D. Roosevelt. You win a silver cigarette holder and a little dog named Fella. Now, who do you suppose took over when Eisenhower died?
Richard Nixon.
Yes. Vice President Richard M. Nixon became the top dog. And at the age of 42 years, 8 months, and 16 days, he was the youngest president ever, beating the record previously held by...
Teddy Roosevelt.
Woo, yes, Teddy Roosevelt. Turn up the AC, Dean McQuarrie, 'cause my students are bringing the heat. Yeah, that's fine. Give yourselves a hand. You deserve it. In our world, Eisenhower is generally regarded as one of the best presidents. A poll of historians a few years ago ranked him at number 5. Nixon was at one time put on the 5 worst, and he came in 28th place in that more recent poll. But let's look at what happened over there. Like here, there Eisenhower won the 1952 election with Nixon as his running mate. He brought an end to the Korean War, championed the construction of the interstate highway system, and presided over the rising tide of prosperity that was lifting all boats in the 1950s. And then he died while vacationing in Colorado. His body was brought by train from Colorado to Washington, where he lay in state at the Capitol Rotunda for 2 days. Thousands of mourners lined up to pay their respects, remembering him for his great role as Supreme Allied Commander in Europe in World War II, just as much as for his role of president. The new president, Richard Nixon, sworn in by newly minted Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren, led the nation in grieving and delivered a moving eulogy in a service that was televised live on all the networks. And after that, a train took the president's body to his boyhood home in Abilene, Kansas for internment. Nixon ably handled the last year of Eisenhower's term. He signed into law the Interstate Highway Bill and continued to ride the rising tide of prosperity. And early in 1956, he declared he would run for election in his own right. To no one's surprise, he was acclaimed at the Republican convention in San Francisco and went on to easily beat Democrat candidate Adlai Stevenson in November, despite crises in Hungary and the Middle East that broke just days before the election. 1957 was not a particularly good year for the president. The Russians beat America into space with the launch of Sputnik. There was a standoff in Arkansas where Nixon was forced to call in federal troops to enforce integration at Little Rock Central High School. And that wonderful economy slid into a 9-month recession that hurt the Republicans in the midterm elections of 1958. Still, Nixon had high hopes as he prepared to run again in 1960.
But he couldn't.
As a matter of fact, he could. Let me quote the 22nd Amendment. I knew someone would ask this question, so I came prepared. No person shall be elected to the office of president more than twice, and no person who has held the office of president or acted as president for more than 2 years of a term to which some other person was elected president shall be elected to the office of president more than once. Pull out the calculator. In addition to his own term, Nixon had served about 16 months of Eisenhower's term. That's less than 2 years, so he could run again. And who do you suppose the Democrats ran against him in 1960?
Kennedy.
Yes, John F. Kennedy, just like here. And because that America had already had a 42-year-old president, Kennedy's youth was not the issue that it was in our world. Just like here, it was a hard-fought campaign. And just like here, Kennedy won. Or did he? In our world, more than 68 million people voted in the 1960 election. Kennedy narrowly won the popular vote, but took the Electoral College by a big margin. Over there, it was Nixon who won the popular vote, but he still lost by a large margin in the Electoral College. That situation had not happened in their world since. Just like here, it's happened twice recently, but before 1960, nobody? Maybe we don't need the AC today. 1888. So that's 72 years. A lifetime. There were not many people around who could remember the previous occurrence, and the reporters of the day had to crack open dusty manuals to see how to cover it. And just like here, there were allegations of voter fraud in Illinois, New Jersey, Missouri, and Texas. Nixon's campaign staff wanted him to ask for recounts and challenge the results. But he saw no chance of winning such a fight and feared that launching one would be bad for the nation. 3 days after the election, he sent Press Secretary Herb Klein to make a brief statement to the press. The president ran the race and accepts the decision of the voters. The decision made on Tuesday stands. From that point on, their 1960s were pretty much like ours. Kennedy started the Peace Corps and pushed the space program and civil rights. He decried the Berlin Wall and stood up to the Russians in Cuba. And he was assassinated. Lyndon Johnson took over. He finished Kennedy's term and ran again in 1964, easily beating Republican nominee Barry Goldwater, whom the Democrats cast as a lunatic who would start World War III. Johnson steered Kennedy's Civil Rights Act through Congress and managed a booming economy. But he also let America go farther into the quagmire of the war in Vietnam. The streets of the nation filled with protests and riots. Knowing he could not win in 1968, he made his famous "I choose not to run" speech. This led to a Democrat melee for the nomination. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated in June, and the convention in Chicago that summer was a zoo. You don't need my parallel world recordings to see that. Just Google "the whole world is watching." It was exactly the same there as it was here. And on the Republican side, up popped Richard Nixon, back to try for the second full term he was denied in 1960. His pledges to restore law and order and to bring an end to the war in Vietnam appealed to enough voters to give him the victory and made him the first president to win non-consecutive terms since...
Grover Cleveland.
Yes, Grover Cleveland. And he was the guy who won the popular vote but lost the election back in 1888. See how it all connects? So over there, the presidential numbers go Eisenhower 34, Nixon 35, Kennedy 36, Johnson 37, and Nixon 38. Now, Nixon wanted to keep the promise to end the war, but that proved to be easier said than done. He could not simply pull out the troops and let the world see America run away with its tail between its legs. What he needed was a face-saving exit strategy. He had hoped that such an exit might be found at the Paris peace talks. Unfortunately, the North Vietnamese had televisions. They had seen the riots and protests in American cities. They knew that U.S. casualties were climbing, and they decided to be intransigent, figuring that if they held out long enough, the United States would simply pick up its ball and go home. So Nixon decided to expand the war into Laos and Cambodia in an attempt to disrupt enemy supply lines. Those lines were indeed disrupted, but still the North Vietnamese did not negotiate with any goal in mind other than making the talks as protracted as possible. So Nixon stepped up the air war, bombing Hanoi and Haiphong. That did get them to the table, and a treaty was signed on January 27, 1973. Peace with honor had been achieved, except not on Nixon's watch. In a final bit of intransigence, North Vietnam held off on signing until after the new president had been sworn in. New president? Well, yes. Nixon couldn't be elected another time. New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller got the Republican nomination and beat George McGovern in the 1972 election in one of the biggest landslides ever. Hopes were high for him to do well. But a funny thing happened on the way to his greatness. Unemployment began to rise, perhaps because the army was no longer drafting huge numbers of young men for the war. Inflation climbed, and when the Arab nations slapped an oil embargo on the West in retaliation for its support of Israel in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, the days of cheap energy came to a screeching halt. The nation tossed Rockefeller 39 in favor of Jimmy Carter 40 in the 1976 election. And Carter? Well, he did no better over there than he did here. After 4 years of a bad economy and humiliation at the hands of Iran, he was turfed in favor of Ronald Reagan, 41. All the presidents after that were the same as here. But let's circle back to that 1972 election. Nixon couldn't run again, so there was no committee to re-elect the president. No break-in at the Watergate Hotel. No cover-up. No scandal. No resignation in disgrace. The impact of all that on our world is undeniable when you contrast it with theirs. They simply do not have the cynicism that we have. And over there, every scandal is not automatically tagged with the suffix "gate." And one more thing I haven't mentioned yet. As in our world, their Nixon went to China in October 1972. He was the first American president to go there, and his visit ended years of diplomatic isolation. It normalized relations between the two countries and ultimately led to you being able to buy cheap mops that break the first time you use them. So let's compare the legacies of the two Nixons. Ours served 2 terms. So did theirs, but not consecutively. Ours got America out of Vietnam. So did theirs. But while ours gets no credit, theirs is lauded. Over there, when Obama brought the surge to Afghanistan, he told reporters, it worked for Nixon in Vietnam. Ours opened relations with China. So did theirs. Ours created the Environmental Protection Agency. So did theirs. But few people here know about those things. They are common knowledge over there. Our Nixon left his post in scandal and disgrace. Theirs ended his in triumph, having fulfilled his biggest campaign promise. Ours handed his successor, Gerald Ford, who never got to be president over there, a faltering economy. Theirs handed his successor, Nelson Rockefeller, a nation of peace and prosperity, even if there were icebergs in the water. He was not on the bridge when the ship of state hit them. Their Nixon was the youngest president ever, and only the second to have non-consecutive terms. Are these facts at all important in determining his legacy? I want your views on the legacies of the two Nixons. Does the horns effect of Watergate entirely negate the accomplishments of our Nixon? Or is their Nixon really that much better? This is a light one. 1,000 words editorial style. Due next time we meet. Class dismissed. Hi, I'm Gary Wheeler. Alternate History 100 is a labor of love with the twin goals of entertaining you and making you think. If you like what you heard today, please hit the subscribe button, give us a like, and tell your friends about us. Your word of mouth can really help this channel grow. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. Until then, keep thinking and make some history of your own.
The preceding was a work of fiction and should not be taken as actual history.